God redeemed and restored my life and Carrie's life and our marriage and our family. I say all the time, I'm never, of course, thankful for the things that I did, but I'm so thankful for my story. I'm as dark as it was, and as much as I hated my life, I'm so thankful that that was my story, because number one, it enabled me, it equipped me to be able to help men in this area where we badly need men. But also, just again, I mean, this is kind of selfish, but like, it allows me to taste the beauty of my life now in such an extreme way that I don't think I would. I don't think I would understand the beauty of God's grace and God's love, not the same way, had I not experienced that deep darkness and that self-hatred and that despair and that hopelessness for so many years.
Thank you for stopping by my podcast, Finding God in Our Pain. Welcome. Hi, I'm your host, Sherry Pilkington. In this podcast, you'll hear firsthand stories of how the God of the Holy Bible meets real people in their real pain. We look at the good God we profess through the lens of pain and suffering. I'm processing the most painful season of my life after unexpectedly losing Larry, my husband of 32 years. In my journey, I've discovered that there are many types of deaths. Maybe you've asked God, how could you let this happen? Why me? Where are you, God? Do you even care? What am I supposed to do with my life now? Here at Finding God in Our Pain, we don't shy away from the tough questions. I ask them to my guests. I share what I've experienced. We give real examples of how God shows up in the darkest, most painful situations in life. May the stories that you hear and the advice you receive encourage you to engage the heart of God about your painful places or memories or experiences or even your unmet expectations. Lean in close to God's heart because He speaks beautiful things in the dark. The topics of sexual addiction or being a sex addict, and really any addiction, is a prison that I know God not only desires to set people free from, but absolutely can break the chains and give people truth and freedom and forgiveness, allowing them to live a life that many did not imagine was possible. My guest, Logan Hufford, has a candid conversation about his struggle with sexual addictions. And while this is a man's perspective, I do believe that my primarily female audience can benefit from what Logan shares. Logan says that 60 to 80% of men struggle with a sexual addiction of some degree. So there is the possibility that someone you love is silently struggling. And I'd like to think that this conversation will give you the courage to bring up this topic, hope in knowing that healing and recovery is possible, and the resources to encourage your loved one to use. Logan is brutally honest about the way he operated in his addiction and the dual life that he was living. After bargaining with God to change him, the simple realization that there were other men who had found freedom from this dark cave of existence was the glimmer of hope that started him on the road to recovery. He also shed some light on the fact that it's a spiritual battle and that Satan's goal is to pervert anything good that God has established, with the family being the number one target. He shares the resources that he has participated in to overcome the demonic grip of addiction. And in this specific conversation, sexual addiction as it pertains to men, he spoke about these resources: the Conquer series by Ted Roberts of Pure Desire Ministries. Logan was saying that that's one of the best resources for someone who wants to understand sexual addiction and the sexual addiction recovery process. It talks about what's happening to the body and the mind, spiritually, physically, emotionally, because it is more than just making a choice. You'll hear Logan talk about how the brain and the body are changed by the very things that God created and meant for our good. But as Logan shares, we can pervert the good things that God has for us. He talked about Prodigals, which is a men's group that offers accountability. And I do believe that Logan said that he himself leads a Prodigals group. The Amends Process, AMENDS, the Amends Process, that is an elective mentorship program. He briefly mentioned Celebrate Recovery. And I know of the Celebrate Recovery programs here in my area because a previous church that I attended sponsors them. It's a 12-step faith-based program that offers hope and help to anyone who's struggling with things such as addiction, codependency, compulsive behaviors. And I'll put the links in the show notes. Oh, and before we get into the episode, at one point, Logan uses the term FOMO, FOMO, FOMO. And just in case you wonder what that means, it's fear of missing out. Let's get into this conversation to discover Logan's journey through addiction and into his willingness to be proactive, engage recovery, and submit himself to God's transforming, sustaining power in exchange for freedom, wholeness, and living the life he once only dreamed of. Logan, I am glad that you're here because I love the passion that you have for the message that you want to share, the forgiveness, the freedom, and the restoration that you've personally experienced in Christ has put a deep calling on your life to let everyone know who struggles with any sort of sexual addiction that they haven't gone too far, that it's not too late, and there's hope, there's healing, there's new life. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Sherry.
Logan, let's lay a little bit of groundwork for the listeners. What was life like before you found yourself in your mid 20s living a double life between a beautiful family and then fully addicted to porn and affairs? Can you give us a brief understanding of your childhood? Is there anything that impacted on why you would end up in a full blown addiction, or nothing at all that would have indicated you would have had an addiction?
Not much. Yeah, not much would indicate it. I had a really good infrastructure, felt very safe, very loved. A baby of 5. I was raised by both my parents, a loving Christian home. And as I say Christian home, I mean, I realize the whole, it doesn't make you a Christian because you're raised by Christian parents, but like I was taught those things. I was, those things were ingrained in me, the principles of not just right and wrong, but why, I had an incredible infrastructure. And yeah, it wasn't enough to keep me from chasing after sin, which I, quickly did.
Well, I think we've all made our mistakes in that regard because, I mean, we do struggle with sin. Because if you think about, what was it, Romans, where was Paul talking about? I'm trying to
The-
remember Romans. I did write it down. Romans 7:15 through 25, where he says, what I want to do, I don't
Right.
do. What I don't want to do, I do. And he talks about the sin nature that's in
Yeah.
us. What's your perspective on overcoming our sin nature? Or is it more about knowing it's present and continually submitting? How do you manage that fight?
There's, that's a big question. There are, when I think back to full blown addiction, or even when I think back to childhood, and then I think back to when my addiction really started to take root, and then when it started to really flower, and then early recovery, and then now, there have been different times in my life where I've responded differently to temptation. There were times where I welcomed it. There were times where I wanted, absolutely wanted to go find porn. When I was a teenager, I mean, that's all I wanted was let me go find porn. Let me seek out attention from a girl. Um, before I was married, same thing. Although it was starting to flower a lot more. Shortly after we got married, June 4th, 2011. So I was 20 when we got married. My wife Carrie was 21. Before too long, I had more affairs, which they started before I even got married, and then they continued. I no longer wanted as just like this pure desire to seek out sin. I no longer wanted it in that way. It was this very much this conflicted piece where it was I, I did want to do those things and I was used to doing those things, but I also had so much self-hatred and despair and shame and I hated that I did those things. Being conflicted to such a high degree that wasn't really present when I was a teenager. So there's that, there's been a difference and there's been a change in terms of like what I truly want, what I'm desiring. But for so long, honestly, up until well into my program, well into sobriety, even the first year or a couple years, maybe, I was still battling that part of me that's like, there's still a huge part of me that really wants it. that wants that sin, even though I don't want it on a different level. Deep down, I don't want it. And so, one of the many things that recovery has done is to help shift that part of my heart. Not to say that I don't get tempted. Absolutely. There's some muscle memory that, old Logan for years did that. And so I've got to battle that. But God has, through many people in my life and through a lot of hard work, I mean, God has done a lot of rewiring of my brain, and God has given me that renewal of my mind to where I can say, no, I don't want to go back to that place. I don't want that. Sin nature, I'm always going to be a fallen human who is saved. Temptation's always going to be there, but there's a big difference in terms of like what I want to do with a temptation.
We're not
Um,
going to be able to get away from it, because just because we're saved doesn't mean we're perfect.
right.
And so I was just curious to know what your thoughts were with in reference to that struggle. Hearing you describe that, it sounds like you came just from maybe a young man's perspective about the interest in women and pursuing women. And then, of course, porn. I think porn is made easier access every year that goes by.
Yeah.
Children younger and younger get access to that. I was wondering, are there any like incremental steps? I don't think we fall into sin. Are there incremental steps that you either took, or what was that like to get to this place of addiction?
I love that point that in reality, we don't fall into sin as if I just tumbled into this hole that I didn't realize was there. Right. And it's something I always emphasize is it in my addiction, it kind of felt like that. It felt like, oh crap, I did it again. Except, through recovery, God's allowed me to see all of these different ways that I had a way out, and I didn't see it, or I didn't want to see it sometimes. Sexual sin, like all sin, it's progressive. Sexual addiction is progressive. The types of pornography that I watched when I was 20 was not the same stuff that I watched when I was 14. The things that I allowed myself to do with other women when I was 23 was not the same stuff that I was even trying to do, let alone allow myself to do when I was 17. So it absolutely is progressive. For me, it was it was just continually chasing after new and different. And I do use the word chasing because it was I became a predator. I became someone who treated the world around me, specifically or especially women, but even just the world around me, even outside of sex. What can the world do for me? What can you do for me? What can you give me? What can I take? And I was pretty good about hiding that. I was pretty good about, wearing the mask of, this nice young man, and whether it's at church or with my family or with people at work. Now, of course, certain people saw through that, like my family definitely saw through that more. When I'm constantly chasing new and different, I gotta get more. I gotta get a different thing. I gotta get a more extreme version, a more risky version, a more perverse thing. And that manifested with pornography, that manifested with, again, how I treated women, how I interacted with women, the types of relationships that I had. And I thought, I thought all of this was just I could turn it off when I got married. I'll get married and then I'll settle down and I'll
Right.
stop doing all that crazy stuff. I know that's not good. I got to shut that down, as if there was just a button to push, and not the case. It
Yeah,
only
because
got
you're
worse.
it only got worse. Yeah, because you're creating neuro. What hormone is, or is it a hormone? Is it a what's released? Uh,
The dopamine. So I'm just going to really quick give a plug for something. This is, I have no affiliation with this. It's just an incredible resource. If anybody wants to understand more about this from a scientific perspective, also a Christian perspective, the Conquer series goes really deep into this of what's happening inside my brain, what's happening inside my body. How does addiction work? Specifically sexual addiction, although most of this applies to any addiction, and the recovery aspect as well of the renewal of my mind, right? And rewiring my brain for good. But yeah, the dopamine hits are extreme. So it's, when I'm saying like chasing after a new high, that's not a metaphor. That's literally what I'm chasing. But it's both. It's, it's the chemical release, the release that's happening through sexual activity is, yeah, that's its own high, but it's even more than that, even greater than that. The high that I would get from, you know, going to specific websites and knowing that the path that I'm going down this spiral, and
Mm.
I'm because I had to like make myself cross barriers. Once I was, especially once I was married, I, I I was gonna say never. I almost never. It was not my MO to just go, oh, I'm home alone, or I'm nobody's around me. I'm just gonna go grab my phone and go look at porn. It would be, let me I'm watching this video that's, maybe it's a little gray area, probably not something I should necessarily be watching, but I'm just gonna watch it. And then let me watch something else. It's a little bit more, and I'm just pushing myself and pushing myself. And it might take 3 or 4 videos before I'm, you know what, I'm gonna go to a porn website. But I'm pushing myself a little bit further, a little bit further. And again, in the moment, a lot of times it felt as if I was being pushed, as if I was just falling down a hill. When in reality, no, I'm taking all these steps, I'm making all these choices, and none of this is meant to ever absolve myself of guilt. I own my choices. I took those steps. Until recovery, I did not have tools, of, okay, well, what do I do other than just, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to think about it. Like, that doesn't work. Don't think about the
Right.
purple elephant.
Right. I often think about this Bible verse because I've pondered it with the Lord before, and I can only apply to what my experience has been. And so, with regard to sexual addiction, 1 Corinthians 6 and 18 through 20, it says, "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does." Do you think that it's because of the neural pathways of reconstructing things like that and putting this inability, really, because you're not dealing with Logan, you're dealing with a chemical imbalance in the brain. Do you think that's one of the things maybe that scripture is referring to? It's
I,
because it says, "For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body."
right. So I'm always hesitant to be like, I am very sure that that's what this verse means. It's like, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a Bible scholar, but people that have studied the scriptures a lot more than me, that are smarter than me when it comes to this stuff, have definitely pointed to that. And so from what I understand, absolutely. Again, Conquer series goes really in depth on that specific piece, because any addiction is destructive, like, not just mentally, not just psychologically, but any addiction. It could be biting my nails. I'm rewiring my brain, right? I'm rewriting my muscle memory. I'm rewriting the way that I do things. The highway, the super highways of my brain. Any addiction does that, but especially certain types of addictions, and sexual addiction is at the top of that. Or maybe there's a couple others that are with it, but it's at the tippy top of the ways that it is so destructive and restructures my body physiologically in addition to everything else. And that manifests with me looking at pornography and masturbating to pornography. I'm gluing myself to whatever I'm viewing. That's not to, I'm not going to get graphic here, but I mean, just, with when somebody has a certain type of thing that they want, whether you call it a fetish or whatever, that's usually where that comes from, is because I have glued myself to this. I've sought out that type of pornography. Now, I may likely seek out more extreme versions of that type of pornography, but I'm locking in on, like, that's the thing that gets me going. If I am engaging in sexual behavior, I'm gluing myself on multiple levels to the environment around me. The Doug Weiss refers to it as sex glue, and it's, I'm gluing myself to that if it's with another person, I'm gluing myself to that person. Again, in that Conquer series, they go into it way more beautifully than I could. If I've had sexual contact with somebody, there is a bond that, of course, God created for beauty, right? God created
Yeah.
for good. God created for this incredible intimacy. That's my ride or die, right? That's my, we'll go into battle together. That's my wife. So when I do that with porn, When I do that with a prostitute, when I do that with, some customer at work that I had an affair with, I'm my body on some level is like, okay, like we have a bond, right? And of course, if I'm having multiple instances like this with different types of people and with different types of porn, I mean, to say that it, is confusing to the body is an incredible understatement, but it's yeah. There's so many reasons why like this is so destructive. Regardless of somebody's religious beliefs, regardless of what
Yeah.
somebody believes spiritually. If they don't believe the Bible, like obviously that's the ultimate piece is I'm sinning against God. But even if somebody's an atheist, it's like you can't tell me that porn's not destructive. You can't tell me that, you know, not being monogamous is hugely destructive for all of these reasons and more.
When you were talking a second ago about, gluing yourself to somebody
Yep.
else, have you ever heard the term soul tie?
I've not.
It's not talked about too often in the church, but I went to what's called Cleansing Stream. And part of that program was to look at soul ties that you created in your life. And they were saying that like you were explaining about that value of intimacy on that level, it brings a bonding between two people. And that's why it's difficult a lot of times for marriages when you don't break these soul ties. And it's more about getting before the Lord and taking accountability for that. And that's probably part of somebody's addiction process and recovery as they move into healing. And so that I didn't even realize that was a thing, but people were talking about how amazing that was and what freedom that it brought into their life. So when you were talking about that glue, it reminded me very much of soul ties. It brought a lot
That
of
makes a
freedom.
lot of sense. I mean, whether it's a little bit different. I mean, and or not. I mean, there's a huge amount of crossover between what you're talking about and just the bonding that happens between people in general, but it happens throughout life. Bonds get created all the time, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I've got to be aware of it. So I was a car salesman for 6 years, and I was a good salesman not because I was such a slick salesman and because I was so smart, because I was good at connecting with people and I was good at getting clients to open up and share what they were looking for and all that. And I completely abused all that, with almost every woman in my path. And so even as goofy as that might sound, even the bond that is created because there is a bond, I'm spending a few hours with somebody, and it's a big purchase. Like there's a bond that gets created there. And so I took that bond and I abused that bond as a way of preying on folks. One thing, just to not to beat a dead horse, but another piece that that I learned about in recovery through that Conquer series, I don't remember if it's serotonin, but there's a chemical that like God created for beauty, right? God created for all this good that gets released when when a mother is nursing her baby, and that gets secreted from her skin, and it's meant to create that bond between mother and baby. And that is also secreted during sex. So you talk about something that, in an ideal situation, mother and baby, husband and wife, beautiful bond, right? Strengthening that relationship. That is happening if I'm having sex with a prostitute. That is happening if I'm having any physical contact, really, where there's skin to skin with somebody else. I mean, you talk about the perversion of, what God intended for good and then doing evil with it. Part of our story is my wife, she got into recovery shortly after me. I got into recovery, serious recovery. Like when I actually started to be serious and took it serious and gained traction was May 19th, 2016. She started going to sexual betrayal trauma recovery in July of 2016. And we've never looked back from recovery. Her from sexual betrayal, myself, sexual addiction, and now we give back. We lead our own groups, and so that's an amazing thing. She, of course, had every right to leave me. She had every right to divorce me if she wanted. The sexual betrayal that I did to her, but she chose to enter recovery, and by God's grace, our marriage has been rebuilt and restored, and the redemption that's happened there. being able to rebuild intimacy with ourselves, with each other, is recognizing all these things that were perverted, all these things that were twisted, that Satan wanted to take what God created and deform it, right? And I did that in my addiction. And yet these ways of bonding, these ways of gluing, like these are ways that God created for good, that a husband and wife, can use for intimacy. So just being aware of how this works.
Back to your point about the bond, even if you think about it, abused children who are being removed from their home do not want to leave. They want to stay with that parent, or even a captive, somebody who's been held
Yeah,
prisoner. They've been abused, but then all of a sudden they're taken up, they're covering, for their abuser and their captor. And so that's interesting dynamic to me, that the brain has been rewired in that way.
right,
And to your point about Satan perverting, I think that's his job. I mean, that's his MO, if you will. He wants to pervert everything that God says is good. Think about
right.
babies, talk about abortion. That right there is killing the heart of God with children. But let me ask you this then, because you guys have done a lot of work in healing and identifying these things. What was the lowest point of your addiction journey? Maybe even the pivotal point?
I don't. The lowest point for me was not the lowest point for Carrie. The lowest point for me was definitely not the pivotal point. I don't even know what the lowest point was for me. There were some moments of extreme shame early on in our marriage. I had a prostitute in our apartment. My wife was working part time at that time, and the prostitute, she stole my wife's wedding ring. So not only did that happen, when I realized what happened, which I didn't realize it until after that, after she had gone. So when Carrie got home, my wife Carrie got home, I started a process that continued for years of lying to her about what happened. And oh my gosh, I got, well, hopefully we can find it. And for years, Carrie would bring that up of like, oh, I'm such a klutz. I lost my wedding ring a few years ago, like to my family and to friends. And so when I opened up to her about that, because I'd given her different confessions, but I didn't tell her about that for several years until recovery. So I mean, that, I don't know if that was the lowest point. That was an extreme low point. And yet that was 5 years before I got sober. That was 5 years before I got into recovery. So it certainly wasn't a pivotal thing. But I share that as, that's how dark this thing can get, right?
Yeah.
The pivotal point, and it was the lowest point for Carrie. Basically the entire month of July. So little context. Almost all of my acting out with other humans. So porn was like my maintenance drug. It wasn't, porn was, once I was married, porn was not the thing I was chasing. Porn was not the thing that excited me. Porn was just, okay, I guess I'll take this for now. But the ultimate high was having, chasing after a woman and taking what I could get in that way, whether it was, flirting, sexual texting, or all the way to a physical interaction. But it was almost, once there was a physical interaction, it almost always ended, and I never had interaction with that person again for a variety of reasons. This one was very different. In July of 2015, I had a month-long affair with a lady that had bought a car for me. And this was, not only there was so much emotional entanglement that was not usually present. This was also somebody who Carrie didn't know personally, but Carrie knew about, and Carrie had seen red flags. Carrie had asked me if there was something going on. When I'm being vague, sometimes it's just, I'm trying not to be graphic. I'm not ever trying to minimize anything. I worked my butt off to cover it up. With this one, like, she had seen stuff, and so she was asking about stuff, and I was lying to her face. So, not by my words, by Carrie's own admission, this was the most hurtful affair, which is a heck of a statement, but that's coming out of her mouth. It was the most hurtful affair of our marriage. And when I confessed, yes, I've been having an affair with this woman. So at the end of July, Carrie did something she'd never done before, and she gave me an ultimatum. And I don't remember verbatim what she said, but it was, if you don't get serious help, then I'm gone and you're going to lose the kids. And that scared the crap out of me because I had long since given up any hope of having a good life. I had long since given up any hope of being a leader of my family, of being a good dad to my boys, of being able to work in, ministry. Like that was years gone. But if I could, I didn't want to lose my boys. I didn't want to not have Carrie in my life. So even just from a selfish perspective, I didn't want to lose that. So that was May 9th, or sorry, May 19th is my sobriety date. That was the end of July or the start of August of 2015. May 19th is my sobriety date. So that's almost a year where I was going to meetings, I was, doing some things, but it didn't have a sexual affair, but still struggled with pornography, still didn't have a healthy infrastructure of decision making. But it started to do some things, which is really weak verbiage, but it's accurate verbiage. But it wasn't until I met a guy named Rick who told me about a group named Prodigals, which was not just Christ-based, because there's other Christ-based groups out there, but this was Christ-based, and it was super intense. It was guys are gonna grill me when I'm getting current. They're gonna ask me tough questions. They're gonna get in my face if need be. Not always, but they're gonna ask me tough questions and give me tough feedback and call me out on my BS, because so many recovery groups, they care so much about safety and anonymity, which is totally absolutely needs to be there. They care so much and they value safety to such a level that safety ends up getting exchanged for a comfort zone. And at Prodigals, it's not that way. It's not a comfort zone. It's a safe space, absolutely. And these guys, they loved me and they love me. I mean, a lot of these guys are, still in town. I still interact with these guys, but they loved me enough to call me out on my crap. Because I was not somebody that, had some light offenses. I mean, I had spent years grooming myself, both intentionally and inadvertently, to be a manipulator, to be a liar, extreme narcissistic tendencies. Like I did not need a comfort zone. I needed people to really get in my face, and Prodigals was that. I realized that was a really long way of answering your question, but that was definitely the pivotal moment, was that affair, and then Carrie's ultimatum. Even though, again, non-linear journey, right?
When you think about the journey you were in, you have this Christian background.
Yeah.
When our goal as parents is to point our children to God, because there is going to be a time when they cry out and he needs to be real for them. They need to know that's who they need to cry out to, but then he has to show up for them in that unique way. Were you having any conversations with God? Had you cried out to God to break this?
So many, so many conversations. Well, I don't know that I would call them conversations. So many times crying out to God. But I mean, I've heard people say this, and it can kind of sound corny, maybe, but like I mean this with all sincerity. Almost any time I prayed, it was like, yeah, I don't think this thing's leaving the ceiling, because I, on one hand, I knew my Bible. Like I grew up reading the Bible in the church. I knew and I always believed in God. I always believed in Jesus dying on the cross, say for our sins. But I also knew, like, well, Satan believes that, and the demons believe that too. Even as a kid, before I got into sexual addiction, I always wrestled with, I don't know if I'm saved. And then once my addiction, really was manifesting, it's like, okay, I guess I'm not, because if I was saved, again, like First John, like, well, I'm not living in the light, so I guess I'm not saved. So, I mean, I would cry out to God, but it was like trying to make deals with God. It was, God, please just take this from me. Like in hindsight, I wasn't willing to do hard work. I wasn't willing to sacrifice. I just wanted God to fix me. Just, can you get in there and do the rewiring and then let me know when I'm all good? I mean, there was so much self-hatred. There's so much despair. I can literally, I mean, I picture our old bedroom in our old house and how many nights laying there going, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my head. God, why did you create me? All I do is hurt people. All I do is hurt Carrie and hurt my boys and hurt these women. Like, why would you create me? Conversations with God probably would not be how I describe it. A lot of prayer, but I wasn't too convinced that it was doing anything. But to your point about parents, I mean, I was again, there's no perfect home, but I was raised in a really good home. I was raised in a home with a lot of love, and my parents did a lot of things right. And I always knew, even in these darkest, especially maybe in these darkest times, how much my mom was praying for me. I mean, I always knew that. And she told me, I mean, she was not shy about it. I remember knowing that she was praying for God to break me. It, that's not a light thing, right?
No, because if you have
Um,
the courage as a mom to pray that God would break you for the purpose of returning to Him and letting Him restore you,
yeah.
that's a powerful prayer.
So it wasn't that them raising me right kept me from falling into sin or kept me from chasing after sin, right? But it did give me an infrastructure that I always knew the value of, even though I took for granted as a kid for sure, but I always knew, like, I always knew the value on some level of God, of Christianity, of a relationship with Christ, even though what I thought I knew the value was back then, what I now it's like far surpassed. It's like, okay, this is what it is to have a relationship with Christ. This is what it is to be able to talk with God. This is what it is to be able to have the Holy Spirit in me. Book knowledge versus actual understanding, right? Not that I've arrived or anything, but
Right.
I'm just, I'm starting to
Mhm.
understand what it is to seek after God.
Backing up just a little bit, when you're praying and you said that your prayers are hitting the ceiling and not really getting past that, do you think that God was asking you to step into the Jordan? What do you think He was waiting for you to do? Did you feel like your prayers were not getting answered?
The short version is the Bible says, like, if I'm in sin, God doesn't hear my prayers. I'm going to pray. I'll put it out there, but I don't think it's going to get to where it needs to go, kind of thing.
That makes sense. That does make sense
And,
when we're in
and when I
sin.
said like deals with God, a lot of that was, whether it was hoping I wasn't going to get caught in a specific scenario. So like, God, if you just like get me out of this situation, I'll never look at porn again. I mean, there was definitely some of that, but then there was also just, again, vending machine God. It's like, hey, God, please just, can you fix me? And then I'll be good. It's like, because then I'll be fixed. Then I won't have these temptations instead of, God, can you present a way out? Can you present a path? I wouldn't have even known that language, right? Looking back, that type of verbiage didn't exist. It was like I got myself trapped in this cave, and I got myself in this cave, but I don't know how to get out or if there's a way out. So it wasn't until I met other men who loved God, who had been in my shoes or some version of my shoes, and they were they had years of healthy living. And I met a lot of guys like that. And so that was when I first had some hope. It was like, I don't know what they did, but I'm willing to try it because I didn't think that existed.
A lot of times, like you today, sharing your story, somebody else is going to hear your story and then they're going to have the courage to go seek out their healing and their restoration. Do you think this is a spiritual battle? And if so, why?
So much. I always say, like, when I'm in our prodigals group that I lead or talking with my family, it's like I don't understand. And I don't think anyone truly understands more than maybe like 0.001% of how spiritual warfare works. But I know it's real. So absolutely. I think, Satan having dominion over the earth and being able to have a high level of influence and demonic influence being real, like absolutely. Because like we talked about, towards the start of our conversation, Satan didn't taint my marriage. Satan didn't taint me. But if Satan can influence me to do that, to twist and pervert my marriage, to twist and pervert my view of sexuality, to twist and pervert all of these things, which of course there's what you mentioned just briefly earlier, the connection with abortion, the connection with, like, all of this is connected, right? Because all of this is an attack on the family. And I'm speaking from my perspective. Of course, I'm a dude. Like, this also absolutely affects women too. The statistics are, it's slightly lower, but it's still a scary high number. It's depending on what you're looking at. It's like 60 to 80% of dudes that struggle with sexual addiction, whether that's porn or something else. And it's like 20 to 40% of women.
I did
So,
see where it says women, as far as their consumption of porn, they're going faster right now than men.
and there's a scary low number of resources for guys, but there are resources out there. There's almost nothing for women. Like, that's super scary. And unfortunately, I don't have a proposed solution. Like, because ideally, given the nature of this, like, ideally, you would have women that had experienced healing from this that could be giving back and leading other women. But all that being said, so even though it affects women too, sexual addiction, I mean, what a win for Satan if I can be this perverted, impotent man, because that was always on the forefront of my brain. Because again, I knew the truth. I should have been a leader of my boys. I should have been the leader of my household. I should have been a loving husband. I should have been all these things. I'm supposed to be the priest of my household, and I'm over here looking at porn. In terms of a win for Satan, the spiritual warfare aspect, I mean, this has got to be one of the top. Where that thing of, if Satan can't take my soul, then of course he's going to try to make a life impotent, right? And this is one of the best ways. Because I saw this image on Instagram, and it's like, this two-sided image. On one, it's like what we think a porn addict looks like, and it's exactly what I would have thought of a sex addict or porn, greasy dude in basement. And then it's like what a sex addict actually looks like. And it's literally just, it's like 6 stock photos of, a businessman, a dad playing with his kids, a pastor, a therapist, an athlete. It's like, yes, that's the thing, is this is not the lowest of society in these, dark, perverse regions. Like, no. This is absolutely, if you would have met me, unless you were my wife or my kids or, close family member, and this is not speculation. Like, I've been told this so many times, you would never have thought that I had this deep, dark addiction. You would never have thought that, because I was really good at hiding it. Both on the level of, unlike a lot of addictions, I'm not smelling like alcohol. You're not seeing, cigarettes in my car. I don't have track marks on my arm. You're not seeing a syringe. So there's the lack of the physical evidence there, unless like you're my wife and you've seen some stuff. But also good at putting on a mask. I was pretty good at putting on a front. Like, we would go to church. I would stand at church and sing worship songs, holding Carrie's hand, knowing what I was looking at the day before, knowing what I was doing the night before.
In your struggle to break free, what was something that Satan would constantly use against you in order to drive that wedge between you and God and keep you in addiction?
The thing that is coming to mind first, I'll share a couple things, but the thing that honestly comes to my mind that's like flooding my brain is actually a little bit off the beaten path, and that's anger. Because anger, we haven't talked about anger this whole conversation, right? We've been focused on sexual addiction. Anger was always my number 2. I struggled so deeply with anger. In fact, it got to a point where several years into recovery, I didn't get an official ultimatum from Carrie, but we had another one of those conversations where she was like, I even if I don't leave you because you cheat on me again, like, if this doesn't stop, you'll lose me for this. Because I would rage so bad. And that didn't just get fixed because I, graduated from a recovery program. That didn't get fixed because I got sober. recovery did absolutely give me tools that I was able to then utilize. And then I just kind of like focused my energy on anger. And I'm not going to say, and then I got fixed or then it's cured, but I can definitely say we've had a huge amount of progressive victory. I don't struggle with anger the way that I did for years. So that the last 2 to 3 years has been a huge amount of victory in that. But anger, honestly, is the thing that comes to mind, because Satan, he would use that, and if I would fall to anger, then it's almost like I would hear that shame of Satan going, "Hey, okay, you don't look at porn, but you just yelled at your son. You don't look at porn, yeah, but you just threw your phone against the wall. You know, you're not different. You just do it differently now. You act out differently." And to some extent, there'd be some truth there, right? But it's living in that shame of just I'm the same old wretched man. I'm the same old terrible husband, terrible dad. So anger was a huge piece that I had to really intensely work on that as well. The other thing too is I got hit with temptations that were new and different as soon as I took recovery seriously. And I emphasize this point to my guys that if I'm taking recovery seriously and I'm starting to make phone calls, I enlist in the program or I'm attending weekly meetings, you don't think for a second Satan recognizes he's about to lose ground and he's not going to try some crap that he's never tried before? I faced temptations that I had never had any interest in, that I'd never faced before, as soon as I started going to meetings, as soon as I started going to Prodigals meetings. And I don't want to do the thing where it's like, every time I'm tempted, every time I'm sin, I just, that was Satan. That was like, I can get myself into trouble just fine. But I absolutely, whether it was Satan tempting me in those exact moments or not, I know he would have been thrilled for me to give in to those new and different temptations, right? But it's like the way I look at it is this monster for years. I treated it like my pet, and I fed it, and I did things with it, and like this monster was my, like it or not, we're conjoined almost. And so I get in recovery, and I'm not connected to it anymore. And then as I get healthier, I'm going to not feed it. I'm also going to lock it up. I'm going to have, barricades and boundaries around that where it's, I don't think it's probably ever dead as long as I'm living on this earth, but it can be starving and it can be, not a part of my routine at all. But number one, that also implies like this imperfect little metaphor implies like, but it exists if I wanted to go after it again. If I wanted to, I could. But the other thing is this: I'm starving it. I'm not feeding it. Well, like, what does any animal do if it's starving? It's going to lash out, right? It's going to try things that it wouldn't normally try if it was healthy and fully fed. So that addiction, that old part of me, is going to try different ways to get fed. And which is all the more reason why I cannot play with this thing. I cannot play with fire. I can't entertain that thought for a few seconds and then I'll just kick it out later. I can't, watch that movie and just I'll just look away and I'll just grit through it. And I mean, all these different things, which they look a little bit different for every person, but like I know what it looks like for Logan to play with fire and think that I can get out before I get burned, because that was my MO for years. So that's a whole other piece of recovery that's just, honestly is a constant journey of learning new ground that I need to cover, new ground that I need to do work in.
When you look at where you're at now in your life, you've made reference to the fact that it's beautiful and you don't want to ever trade any of that, any of your old habits or ways for what you now have and what you know. So, what was Satan trying to keep you from knowing or doing or realizing, whether it was about your life or about God, how he created you? What is it that he never wanted you to find out?
I think about it as two scenes from a movie side by side. And on one side you have, here's Logan, age 21, age 23, age 25. Here's Logan in the darkest of his addiction, married with kids, just constantly, going to porn, going to affairs, all this stuff, right? And so I'm hating myself and I'm going, why, God, why did you create me? And then here's me now, totally not perfect, but having experienced a lot of transformative healing. And I don't say this with anything other than gratitude. I know why God created me. God created me to give back in this way, to help other men, find their own way out of this cave. Satan absolutely, I'm sure, thought he won, right? In the life of Logan Hufford, Satan thought he had a sweet, sweet victory, and I thought he had victory. And God took something that was so dark and so evil and so twisted and broken, and God took it back. And God redeemed and restored my life and Carrie's life and our marriage and our family. I say all the time, I'm never, of course, thankful for the things that I did, but I'm so thankful for my story. I'm as dark as it was, and as much as I hated my life, I'm so thankful that that was my story, because number one, it enabled me, it equipped me to be able to help men in this area where we badly need men. But also, just again, I mean, this is kind of selfish, but like, it allows me to taste the beauty of my life now in such an extreme way that I don't think I would. I don't think I would understand the beauty of God's grace and God's love, not the same way. Had I not experienced that deep darkness and that self hatred and that despair and that hopelessness for so many years. Yeah, I get fired up when thinking about it, just because I remember so much what it was to be in those days. I remember those nights,
Mm.
and I don't think about them in an unhealthy way. I don't wallow in them like in shame, but I remember very vividly, what it was to hate the essence of who I was. And so now being able to be so thankful for what God has given me and what God has done in my life, I praise God, because it's all glory to him.
You just mentioned you don't carry around that guilt and shame. And so, and I think there's a disconnect between accepting God's forgiveness and then forgiving ourselves. How did you come to the realization of forgiving yourself? Is it that you grasped God fully about his forgiveness and then poured over into your guilt and shame against yourself?
It would sound really good if I was like, absolutely that. I don't know. I don't know that it was that way. The thing that, again, the thing that floods my brain when you ask that question is going through the amends process, because the recovery process that I went through, it's a Christ-centered 12-step program. So it's like a 2-year voluntary house arrest, super, super intense. And it's this beautiful marriage of looking at the science of this, like we've talked about before, but also completely centered around a relationship with Christ and a lot of scripture, and also a lot of tangible and concrete practical tools. So it's all three of these things: what's going on inside my body and what needs to happen inside my body and my brain. What does God say about this? Where's my relationship with him at? Right? What does scripture say? But also, okay, like that all sounds great at a men's retreat. What are you going to do differently tomorrow? What are you going to do differently, the rest of today, Logan, after you leave our mentor meeting? I was like, Rick would, and other men, would hold me accountable to that stuff. And the amends process was part of that, that 12-step process. It's towards the back end. It was about a year and a half into my program that I went through the amends process, where I'm, giving as much as I can control it, giving amends to people that I hurt, which a large portion of that was sexual harms. And not to go into a whole thing, but just, for a few reasons, it's strongly encouraged in almost any case that if it's a sexual harm, that I give an indirect amends. Now there are cases where a direct amends is appropriate, but generally speaking, it's going to be an indirect amends, where I'm writing out a letter and it's going to take time. It's going to be I've gotten a lot of feedback from other brothers and from my mentor on this letter. It's not something I just write off the cuff. And it's not something I write, the moment I join recovery. It's after I've experienced some healing and started to be able to think differently. And when I went through those indirect amends, it took a few months. Maybe it took about 2 months for me. Some guys, there was one guy that had so many amends. It took him several months to go through that. But we take our time on purpose so that I can own what I did, so that I can fully absorb the weight of what I did in a healthy way, in a controlled environment, not by myself, but with other men, other godly men who've experienced a lot of healing themselves. And I mean, those rooms that I sat in going through those amends, God did a lot of work.
With the amends process, is this something across the United States?
So the group that I lead a chapter of and that I found in 2016, when that group is called Prodigals, and that's just a weekly group that anyone can show up to that group as long as you can say two things. If you're a man, and then also, are you here to work on sexual addiction? If you can say those two things, then you can show up, and it's a weekly meeting. Then there's the mentorship program, which is an elective program. That's that voluntary house arrest. So the Prodigals mentorship program. So there's plenty of guys that might show up to the weekly group but not do the program. There are other Prodigals groups. I don't know if there are groups worldwide or not, but there are other groups in the United States. But one thing I always say, and this is, I know nothing about the other groups that are out there. I don't know who leads them. I don't know who's a part of them. I don't know how much, sobriety those leaders have and how much healing. So they might be awesome resources. They might not be, because one thing I've definitely come to realize is every group is different. And,
Okay,
I've been to celebrate recoveries that are awesome.
Yeah.
That are led by people with a lot of health. I've also been to some celebrate recoveries that are like, yeah, there's not a lot of lives here that inspire hope. And that sounds really mean, maybe, but it's the truth. And it's like, it's not that those people are not doing good work putting together a meeting, but if I'm going to go to a recovery resource, whether it's a therapist or a group or whatever, I'm going to try to find not the perfect group, but I'm going to try to find a resource that, again, there's something there that I want. There's healing there that I want. So again, it's a long way of saying there are other Prodigals groups, but you may well find, whatever city you're in, or your listeners, you may find a group that is not Prodigals that might actually offer more healing, depending on who's leading it, what they believe, and the makeup of that group.
That's a good point. Because even when I know therapy, a lot of times if you go to a therapist, you need to find the one that you click with, that you have a good
Right.
connection with. And so you might have to keep looking when it comes to that.
Yeah.
All right. We've run out of time, Logan. So let me wrap up with these final two questions. And the first one is there anything that I have not asked you about that you want to share with our listeners today? Or have we covered everything?
Well, you never cover everything, right? Like, there's so much to this. But no, I mean, there's nothing obvious like, oh my gosh, we need to dive into this other topic. I will just say, you mentioned some resources. So I have been spending a tremendous amount of energy doing two things: guesting on podcasts, shouting from the rooftops, and then also now using Instagram. So I have an Instagram that's specifically for sexual addiction recovery. It's pointed a lot at, if you're a guy that is struggling, but also, like I talked about with the Conquer series, if you're just somebody who wants to understand, how an addict's brain works, what it is to be in recovery, how these tools work, please check that out. It's at No Longer in Bondage. There's periods in between the words. I'll make sure you have the link and everything.
Okay.
But if you want to just understand more how to grow accountability, how to use these tools, the dangers of different versions of sexual addiction, I go deep on all that, and I put consistent videos out daily.
Well, we'll definitely get people connected up with you as a resource as well. And then I'm sure it sounds like you share all the other ones, the Conquer series,
Yeah.
and you spoke about the Prodigals and
Yeah.
mentorship through this and several other things. So we'll point them to you, and then you can get them pushed out into the areas that they may need. The last question that I have for you is, if our listeners remember only one thing about our conversation today, what is the one thing that they must remember?
I want this to be encouraging, but I also hope that this can be convicting. If you're someone that is any version of what I was, where just felt hopeless, felt I was too deep in this, I had done too much, there's no hope for me. I get it. Been there, lived that. So at this point, I mean, you heard my story. More importantly than my story, there are many other stories like mine of other guys in this town and in other towns who I know, that have experienced this healing. So there's not an excuse to say I don't think that there's hope for me. I've met a lot of guys with all kinds of different stories, and I've done terrible things. I've met some other guys that have done things that society would deem even worse, and that have experienced transformative healing. There is no sin and there is no addiction that is so deep that if I'm willing to submit myself to God and godly men and godly structures, that God cannot do work and do healing. Again, it's going to look different for different people, but ultimately recovery and healing is available. But you've got to want it. You've got to reach out and connect with other people, connect with resources.
God's value system is so different than ours. When I hear the word submission, a lot of people are scared of that word. They think it's weak, but you are not asking them to submit to something or someone. You're asking them to submit to God and
Right.
to find that restorative, transforming power that He has for us as believers.
Yeah.
Logan, thank you for your time. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for the message. And I hope that someone finds the strength and the courage today for the healing that you're now walking in. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Sherry.
Thank you for your time and for sharing this experience with my guest. I hope you have found encouragement for today and a deeper revelation of God's heart in the midst of pain and suffering. We'd love to have you as a subscriber to Finding God in Our Pain so that you can be connected with all my guests as they share their personal experiences and professional knowledge about pain and suffering. And because this podcast is a division of the website A Life of Thrive, for more information and the various ways you can connect with us, please visit the website alifeofthrive.com. I look forward to sharing more transparent stories from the hearts of women who intimately know what it means to have their world flipped upside down, their authentic struggle to make sense of it, and what recovery and healing looks like. Till then, sweet woman, remember you are not alone and that God speaks the most beautiful things in the dark.